was asked yesterday with regards to the status of an animal that was slaughtered. Whether it gives off impurity or not. And so I'm going to share with you from the Rambam. You see, at the end of Parsha Shmini, it talks about how when you have a non-kosher animal, right? If somebody touches the carcass of a non-kosher animal, that imparts impurity. However, with regards to what happens when it's not a carcass, right? But perhaps either a non-kosher animal was slaughtered in a kosher way, so it's not a carcass, although it is a carcass, but it was slaughtered in a proper way. It wasn't prey to some other wild animal, or a kosher animal that was slaughtered. What are the laws? So here's with regards to its imparting impurity. So this is the laws of Shar Avot HaTumah from the Rambam, and we have in halacha, the first halacha over here. It says when a non-kosher domesticated animal, a wild animal, was slaughtered. So that means you took a horse or something like that and you slaughtered it, even though it's not going to make it kosher to eat because it's not a kosher animal. So shechting it with a kosher knife ain't going to help you really. But nevertheless, it says it does not impart the impurity of a carcass as long as it is in its death throes, unless its head is cut off. So instead, it is considered as impure food. If it is killed by being stabbed in the throat, and it is in its death throes, as long as it makes convulsive movements, it is not even considered as impure food. So that's with regards to a non-kosher domesticated animal. It seems from this halacha that once it actually does die, even though it was shechted, it seems nevertheless it will impart impurity to the person that comes into contact with it. However, if we scroll down to 6th halacha, here it says when an animal that was a treifa. Now, a treifa basically means that one of its internal organs were punctured in such a way that it would not live very long. It wouldn't live for 12 months. So what happens if you take a domesticated kosher animal that was considered to be a treifa and you slaughtered it properly? So it was slaughtered in the proper manner. Even though it is forbidden to be eaten, right? It is pure, which means that despite the fact that the animal is now dead and it's a treifa that you can't eat, it is still pure, which means it doesn't impart that impurity. Similarly, when a person slaughters an animal and discovers a dead fetus, the slaughter of its mother purifies it from imparting the impurity associated with a carcass. And that's a whole another discussion about a ben pakua. Basically, you have an animal whose mother was slaughtered in a kosher way, and the mother's slaughtering was deemed to be kosher. Then the fetus, if it's still alive, is no longer obligated to be shechted. One can eat it without shechting it. One can kill it in another manner. Now, this is not a very often practiced halacha. In fact, I'm not sure if anybody practices it, but I remember reading that Reb Shrira Gaon, one of the Gaonim, used to do this practice so that once in a while, so that his children should know that such a practice exists, because it's very, very uncommon. But here what he's saying is that even if the fetus inside wasn't alive, but because the mother was shechted in a kosher manner, that would make the fetus also to not be impure and impart impurity. So therefore, it would not impart impurity to the person touching it. So that's just something I wanted to touch upon before we started the shir today. as mentioned right at the beginning to Mordechai, that unfortunately I didn't have as much time as I would have liked to research it properly, but that's what I was able to find from a bit of a look around to see what the law would be regarding that. Okay, we're holding Daf Chof Beis Amud Aleph. We're holding a couple of lines down. No, the top of the page, the first line of Daf Chof Beis Amud Aleph. Okay, so let's just briefly review what we're talking about. We're talking about the first case of the Mishnah. The first case of the Mishnah is when a person immerses one vessel inside of another vessel. We ask whether it is going to be okay and a legitimate immersion, and thereby making the vessel pure or not. So we say for Truma it is, but for Kodesh it is not enough, and therefore if you did immerse it one vessel inside of the other, it's no longer, it's not going to be considered a proper immersion for Kodesh. So there was a discussion that Rabbi Ilah says that the reason for it is because of the concern of an interposition, a chatzitza, despite the fact that later on in the Mishnah, we mentioned another case, which is about, because of our concern about an interposition. Nevertheless, he maintains that both cases in the Mishnah are talking about a chatzitza. And he goes according to his understanding, right? And the understanding is that there are 10 different stringencies by Kodesh over Truma, and the first 5 refer to things which apply equally to Kodesh and to food that is non-consecrated, but you want to prepare it on the level of Kodesh. So the rabbis were concerned about these first 5 things. And the last 5 things, the rabbis were only concerned about Kodesh itself, but not non-consecrated food that were prepared on the level of Kodesh, which means to say those other concerns, right, would only apply in the case of Kodesh, but not in the case of Truma, and not in the case of Chulin that was prepared on the level of Kodesh. So that's Rabbi Ilah's reasoning, that the concern is chatzitza. But then Rava came along and said, in fact, that there's a different reason, and it's not chatzitza. The only time the Mishnah talks about the concern of chatzitza is going to be with the instance of the garments that got tied or they were loosely knotted. In that case, the Mishnah is concerned with chatzitza, but in the beginning, the first case, it has nothing to do with chatzitza, but rather it is a concern about a gezerah that we make, that we're concerned if you're going to allow putting one vessel inside to another vessel, then a person might conclude that they can put needles and spinning forks into a small bottle that would be with an opening that is less than the required size, and as a result of that, it wouldn't be a good immersion. We only make that concern, we only make that gezerah with regards to Kodesh, but we don't adopt that concern with regards to Truma. And we're saying now that this is where we're up to, Savala Rava, whose opinion we just mentioned, that we're concerned about the needles and the spinning hooks, forks that one might put into a bottle that was less than, that had an opening less than the size of the required size. So he says, Savala Kahad Amar of Nachman. So in his looking at our Mishnah, right, he's looking at it in the same way that Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Bar Avua, the way Rav Nachman said in the name of Rabba Bar Avua, which was that Achas Esrei Milas Shanukan, there are actually not 10, as Rabbi Ilah says, but rather 11 different stringencies over here in our Mishnah. Sheish Rishonos, the first 6 apply, Bein LeKodesh, Bein LeChulin Shenas Al Tarsa Kodesh, both to Kodesh and to Chulin that were prepared according to Tara standard of to the Tahara standard of Kodesh, and Achronos, but the last 5 apply only the kodesh to kodesh, avaloi lechulin shenasu al taras kodesh, and not the chulin that were prepared according to the Tara standard of kodesh, which means to say, according to Rav Ilah, right? According to Rav Ilah, there are 10 standards. Why the 10 standards? Because 2 of the ones mentioned are really the same stringency. However, in regards to Rava, he comes along and he is in agreement with Rav Nachman, who said in the name of Rabbi Bavoa that there are not 10, but 11, because he considers these 2 cases based on different stringencies. One is to do with chatzitza, and the other is to do with the gezerah concerning not immersing things in a vessel that is going to have an opening that is not wide enough for the required opening. Now the Gemara asks what it will often ask: "Mai ika ben Rava the Rabbi Ilah?" What is the practical difference between Rava and Rabbi Ilah? Because seemingly, so long as you have these stringencies, right? They both agree that they are stringencies. They just disagree as to why they are enacted. What's the practical difference? Is there any practical difference? So the Gemara answers that ikabenayu, there is a practical difference. And what is going to be the practical difference? It is sal vergargusni shemilon kelen vitvilon. In the case of a basket or a large strainer, the one filled with vessels and he immersed them. So now we're talking about something which is a big basket, which it's a big opening. You know, when we talk about a vessel, inside of a vessel could be a cup. Now, a cup that can have different size openings. You can have a jar. It has a different size opening. You can have bigger openings and smaller openings. But when you're talking about a basket, right, or a big strainer, so obviously the opening is a massive opening. And so in that case, you're going to have a practical difference based on why you hold the Mishnah made this enactment, the special decree of not putting a vessel inside of another vessel. So according to the one who says the reason why the rabbis said you cannot put one vessel inside of another vessel when you're immersing it is because of an interposition. Then Ika, you still have this problem even when you have a basket or a large strainer, because the weight of one vessel inside that basket is going to press down on the bottom of the basket, and it still might serve as an interposition, and not all of the water will be able to reach the bottom of your vessel. But Laman Omar, according to the one who says, B'shum Gzeira, that it's because of a decree that he says that the decree was in order to prevent a person from coming to making a mistake and immersing needles and spinning hooks in a vessel whose opening is not the right size of an opening for it to be connected to mikvah. Then he would say that in the case of this basket, it's absolutely fine. We've got no concern. That would be the practical difference between the two. Now, the Gemara comments and says, Rava goes according to his opinion, which is stated elsewhere. What does it say elsewhere? The Amar Rava, it says elsewhere that Rava said, Sal v'gargusni. If you have a basket or a large strainer, shemilon kalin, that you fill them up with vessels, vitvilon, and you immerse them, the halacha is tahirin. They're tahar. So here we see that this is exactly the case what we're talking about, where you immerse one vessel inside of another vessel, and Rava allowed it. And speaking specifically in a case where it's not just any old vessel, it's a basket which has a large opening, and so there's nothing to be concerned about. Now, continuing on with the statement that Rava made elsewhere, he said also that mikvah. Yes.
What's the translation of gargutni?
Gargusni. So, gargusni is it's a strainer which they used in the process of straining the wine in the vats. So once they picked all the grapes and they put them in this vat, so before it went into the pit, the holding pit of the of the wine, they would put this basket to serve as a strainer. So, it had a big opening and it had lots and lots and lots of holes, right? So the main concern we said that Rava had was, is the opening big enough to connect with the mikvah waters and not serve as a separate mikvah that is not really connected to the main mikvah because the opening is not enough, or not? So in the case of this basket, it clearly has a big enough opening. So therefore, there's really no concern. Okay?
Got it.
But now we have to understand that because the concern here is the opening, we're not talking about how big the holes of the strainer are. We're talking about how big the opening on the top is. So it says that Rava continued to say that if you have a mikvah, right, that is 40 saw. So he says, or mikvah, and mikvah shechilkoi, that you split it up. So now it's not 40 saw, but each side has 20 saw. But what is dividing it? Besal v'gargusni, with a basket or a strainer, which means that kind of material. You use it to make a partition between one side and the other. So now just forget about the opening. We're just talking about the material and the many holes that these strainers or basket might have, not the top of it, but the actual in between the whatever you call it, the material itself, right? So he says the halach is hatevel sham. If you now immerse yourself in one of the sides of those mikvah, so in that mikvah, so also tefillah, the immersion is not effective for him. Why? Because ultimately you no longer have one body of water that has 40 saw, because there's a divider between the two, and although there are many small holes, right, but nevertheless it is still going to serve as a partition. Now, 1 second. Why should that be the case? Why can you not consider it to be one mikveh? After all, there are lots of holes allowing all the water to go to and fro. So the Gemara answers, because we see this is the halacha with regards to the earth. When you make a mikveh and you want to get the water coming in from, let's say, a river, right? So, or from a spring from underneath, right? If there isn't 40 saw in the actual ground that you've dug, in the pit that you've dug, the fact that the earth still has lots of pores, lots of holes, right, which technically could allow some water to get through. Nevertheless, we say it's still not going to be a kosher mikvah until you have 40 saw in that one place. So we want to apply the same thing when it comes to putting this strainer or this basket in between two sides of a mikvah, that although there are lots of pores, lots of holes for the water to go to and fro, nevertheless, it's going to be considered a mechitza, and it's not going to be considered a kosher mikvah for one to immerse himself. So let's read it inside. The ha'ara, because the earth, kula chalchule mechalchala, it's full of little holes, little pores, right? And we still required the ika arba'im sa'a b'makim echad. You still required to have 40 saw of water in one place. Okay, so now we said that if a person put in his little needles and his spinning fork into a bottle, and the opening of the bottle is not the required size to make it connect to be a proper mikvah with the original mikvah, we say that that invalidates the immersion, and those pins, those needles, are still impure. Says the Gemara, Vahani Mile, when do these words apply? When is it true that it is not going to be a proper immersion? B'kli tahar, if the outer vessel, which means the vessel that you're putting all these things into, is tahar already. Since it is tahar already, and it does not require its own immersion, so then you're going to consider it to be a separate mikvah. And since you're considering it to be a separate mikvah, it does not connect with the kosher mikvah because it doesn't have the appropriate opening size. Avol bikli tamei. But what happens if this bottle, which doesn't have the appropriate opening to make it connect with the mikvah and serve as a kosher mikvah, right? What happens if that vessel itself is tamei? So what does it mean? It means that I need this bottle, let's say, I want it to be kosher, meaning I want it to be tahor. Why? Because I'm about to get some tahor wine and I want to come and bring it to the kohen. So in order to bring it to the kohen, I've got to make sure that the vessel is tahor. Okay? Now, what about the fact that the opening is very small? It doesn't matter because I'm not trying to make this bottle into a mikveh right now. I'm trying to just give it a tahara. I want it to become pure. So the Gemara says that when you're talking about a vessel that is tamei, and therefore it requires immersion, and now you're going to put it into the mikvah, and then you say, oh, you know what? I'm already putting this into the mikvah. Why don't I stick inside some needles and some forks and get them all those also immersed at the same time? So we say, in that case, migu the salka tefila lekule gufa the mana, since the immersion is effective for the entire body of the vessel, including obviously its inside, because there's no such thing as immersing something and only the outside becoming tahar and the inside not becoming tahar, right? You've got to fully immerse it so that the water fills up the entire inside, so that the outside and the inside all become tahar. So therefore, since the inside is also becoming tahar by the mikvah waters entering in it, so salkalahu nami lekelim deisbei. It also will end up being effective for the little vessels that are inside of it. Okay, Ditnan, as we've learned in the Mishnah, Kalim shemilon kalim, if vessels were filled with other vessels, vehit bilon, and he immersed them, hari elu tahirin, then they are tahar. Now let me just clarify something here for a moment. This Mishnah that we're quoting is talking about truma. It's not talking about kodesh, because obviously we just said over here in our Mishnah that when it comes to kodesh, that's not going to be okay. So then why are we bringing this Mishnah? This Mishnah we're bringing it because this Mishnah, when it talks about putting one vessel inside of another vessel, doesn't make any distinction between a vessel that has the appropriate size opening or a opening that is too small, which means to say that this Mishnah is of the opinion that no matter what size the opening of your vessel is, you can put other vessels inside of it, right? And you can immerse it, right? Now, if we are concerned that putting in a vessel inside of another vessel, right, would not be a legitimate immersion if the opening was too small, then the Mishnah would have said so over here. It would have made that distinction. But the fact that it doesn't make that distinction means that even if the opening is too small, we're not concerned. Why is that? Because it says over here that you can take a vessel and fill them up with other vessels and immerse them, meaning immerse the outer vessel, which seems to imply that it is the outer vessel that you're mainly concerned with to make it pure. And since that's what your concern is, by having them immersed and them becoming tahar, the vessels that you have put inside will also become tahar. That is what we try to learn from this Mishnah. The Mishnah that we're quoting continues, and it says, but if you did not immerse the outer vessel, then mayim hamayravim, the water in the outer vessel that is mingled with the water of the mikvah, right, cannot purify what's contained in the outer vessel, which means all those needles or those spinning forks, unless they are mingled through the opening that is the size of at least a skin's bottle's tube. That's the appropriate size, and 2 fingers worth of opening in at the opening of the keli. So now this end of the Mishnah sounds a little bit strange. What does it mean, ve'im loy toval? So that's what the Gemara immediately asks. My kama, what are you saying? If you did not immerse it. Hachikama. This is what he's actually saying. We're talking about in a case where the person doesn't need to immerse the outer vessel because it itself is tahar. So therefore, he has no need for it to be immersed. In that case, so now the water that's going into it is not serving to purify it, but rather you're using this bottle or this vessel as a, so to speak, separate mikvah that you're trying to connect to this mikvah. So therefore, now in that case, the water that's mingled with the water of the mikvah can only be considered to be a kosher mikvah when the water that are mingled is through the interface of the size of the opening of this skin bottle's tube. That's like kind of a spout at the top of the bottle that is at least 2 fingers wide. Okay, so here we've now established the difference between Rabbi Ilah and Rava. The difference is going to be in a case where you have a basket that is a big basket, and you want to put other vessels in that basket. We would say that there's no concern whatsoever, both for Kodesh and for Truma. However, in a case of a small bottle, I'm sorry, let me correct myself. That we do say it is a problem because in the case of Kodesh, we're worried that you might come to immerse needles or spinning forks in a smaller vessel, in a smaller vessel. That's why you cannot do one vessel inside of another vessel. However, in the case of this big basket, it would be fine. Okay, is everybody on the same page? Are we all okay? Any questions? Okay, so now the Gemara is going to do something that it doesn't like to do. Generally speaking, when the Gemara says that perhaps this argument between Amoraim, which are later rabbis, is really a disagreement that exists with earlier rabbis, with Tanoim, the Gemara usually wants to show how it's not, because otherwise, what's the point of the argument? But it seems in this case that the Gemara remains with the conclusion that the machlekes between Rava and Rabbi Ilah is actually a machlekes that exists between Tanoim as well. This dispute between the Amoraim of Rava and Rabbi Ilah, Tanoi is actually a earlier dispute between Tanoim. The Tanya, for thought in the Braisa, Salvagargusni, when you have this large basket or strainer, Shemilam Kalim, that he filled up with the vessels. Vihit Bilon, and he immersed them, Bein LaKodesh, Bein LaTruma, whether it was for Kodesh or whether it was for Truma, Tahirin, they are Tahar. No. So the Tanakama seems to be holding according to Rava. That's Rava's opinion. Okay, that's exactly the opinion that we showed over here from Rava. Abashol says, Latruma, it can become tar for Truma, Avaloi LaKodesh, and not for Kodesh, which that seems to be the exact opinion of Rabbi Ilah. And the Gemara seems to leave it at that. The Gemara seems to say that, yes, it is a machlekes that exists earlier between Abashol and the Tanakama of this brisa that we're quoting. Now, the Gemara wants to understand that if these problems, if these concerns are real concerns, if that's the case, meaning that there's a legitimate concern about the validity of immersing a vessel inside another vessel, right? So then the question is, Truma Nami, then we should have this concern about Truma as well. Why are we not concerned about it with Truma? Again, whether it's chatzitza or whether it is because we're concerned that a person might come to immerse these needles inside a bottle. Nevertheless, this problem should be a real concern with regards to truma as well. And for the Gemara, leman ka'am kamrinan, to whom are we saying these laws that they should be concerned? It must be chaverim. We're saying these things to chaverim. Okay, what does that mean? A chaver is somebody who is both well versed and careful when it comes to the laws of Tumah Tahara. So we're assuming that if you're saying these things to chaverim, 1 second, chaverim made the yodeh. Chaverim are completely knowledgeable about the laws of immersion, and therefore focusing in over here on the first law of the Mishnah about putting one vessel inside of another vessel. What's your concern? Your concern is about chatzitza. Your concern is about a gezerah, about putting small needles into a smaller bottle. These laws that you're concerned about are well known to chaverim. So why are you making these special extra stringencies? Ihachi, if the case is that you are concerned about chaverim, right, and it's despite the fact that they know the halachas, then, if these halachas are things that you're telling chaverim, and because of that, you're not concerned that they're going to make these mistakes when it comes to truma, then ihachi, if that's the case, kodesh nami, you shouldn't be concerned when it comes to kodesh either. Because again, who are you talking to? You're talking to chaverim, and chaverim are people who know the law, and these are people who are careful with these laws. They're never going to come to allow for a vessel inside of another vessel to not fully be immersed and have all of the parts of it have water contacting it. Right, that's what you're concerned about with chatzitza. They're never going to put these needles into an opening, into a bottle that doesn't have a big enough opening. So we shouldn't have that concern with kodesh either. And for the Gemara, so rather, what must we be talking about? Yes, we're talking about halachas that we're telling to who? To the chaver, but our concern is not the chaver himself. Our concern is Chazilei Am Ha'aretz, and Am Ha'aretz is going to be watching him in the mikveh when he's immersing these things in the mikveh, Va'azil Matbil, and he is going to likewise immerse one vessel inside of another vessel, and he's the one that might come to make a mistake. I'm not worried about the chaver. I'm worried about the Am Ha'aretz who's going to see the chaver putting one vessel inside of another vessel, and then him going and doing the same thing, and then this Am Ha'aretz is not going to be careful whether it's to do with an interposition, the chatzitza, or whether he's going to put these needles into a small bottle. He's the one I'm concerned about. And if I allow you, Mr. Chaver, to go and do it in this manner, then I'm concerned what's going to happen with the Am Ha'aretz. So the Gemara asks the most logical question. Then Teruma Nami, where the same thing should be applied to Truma. Why? Because Chazilei Am Ha'aretz, the Am Ha'aretz is going to watch you immersing your vessel inside of another vessel for Truma, V'azal Matbil, and he'll do the same for his Truma. So what's the difference? You still have the same concern. And for the Gemara, Loi Mekablina Minayu, because we're not going to accept truma from an Am Ha'aretz. So, if an Am Ha'aretz sees a chaver taking one vessel and immersing it in another vessel, and then he does the same thing, and his immersion was not careful, and it may have been a chatzitza, or he used this small bottle, whatever the case may be, we're not worried if he brings truma wine or in this bottle, right, or truma food in this in these vessels. We're not worried because we're not going to accept truma from this Am Ha'aretz. We're not going to accept it from him because we assume that the Am Ha'aretz is not careful with the laws of Tumah Tahara, and therefore we're not going to accept his truma. Okay, well then, if that's the solution, that you're not going to accept the truma from the Am Ha'aretz, use the same thing when it comes to Kodesh. Kodesh, nami lo nekabel minayu. Then don't accept Kodesh from them either. What's Kodesh? Kodesh are the sacrifices. Don't accept their vessels for the use of sacrifices either. What's the problem? And for the Gemara, Havele Eva. That's not going to be possible, because if we're not going to accept Kodesh from an Amaretz, which means to say, if he's going to use his vessel, right, which he claims that he immersed into a mikvah, and we're going to say, I'm sorry, we're not accepting your sacrifice, or we're not accepting your vessel, then there's going to be enmity between the Chaverim and between the Amaretz. Frag the Gemara, why are you only concerned about this enmity that's going to happen if you don't accept his Kodesh, and not concerned about enmity that might happen if you reject his Truma? That's what the Gemara now asks. Truma nami havela eva. Isn't Truma and rejecting his Truma going to ultimately result in enmity towards us? And for the Gemara, no. Why? Because lo ichpaslei. He's not concerned if we don't accept his Truma. Why is he not concerned? Because ultimately he's got recourse. Because the Ozil Yohim Lekoyen Ama Oretz Chavri, he can take this Truma and find one of his own Chaverim who's an Am Ha'aretz, who's willing to just take the Truma from him without asking any questions, because this Kohen who's an Am Ha'aretz is not careful either with the laws of Tumah Tahara, and so therefore he will accept it, and so therefore there's no need to be concerned that there's going to be Ava. However, if we're going to come along and say, I'm not going to accept your sacrifices, well, where's he going to go? There's no two Beis Hamikdash. There's only one Beis Hamikdash. There's only one place for him to come and bring his sacrifices, and if we don't accept his sacrifice, that's going to be considered enmity, because there is no recourse. There's nowhere else for him to go. So therefore, we come along and we say that when it comes to immersing your Kodesh into a mikvah, a vessel that you're going to use for Kodesh, don't put one vessel inside of another vessel, because the Amaretz will see that and he will do the same, and he won't be careful like you'll be careful, and that's going to be a problem for us. When we learned this last time, I mentioned that I asked my friend, big Talmud Chacham, I had a question about this, and I was like, how is the Amaretz going to know whether you're immersing your vessel in the mikvah for Truma, or you're immersing it for Kodesh? And he told me that it seems that in those days, there was a certain extra reverence associated with immersing something for Kodesh than for Truma, that it would have been obvious to the Amaretz that right now, what he's doing is immersing this for Kodesh. Whether the person audibly articulated, I'm now immersing this for the purpose of making it Kodesh, so therefore you heard him say that he was immersing it for Kodesh, or there was some kind of procedure that was done that was unique to make sure that it was clear that there's a distinction between the immersion you're doing for Truma and lower levels and something that you're immersing into the mikvah for the purpose of Kodesh. So that was something that I wasn't sure of, but that's what he explained to me. Okay, so now, yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
Wasn't the Amharites in those more aware of things that were happening as opposed to what's happening, over the generations? I mean, there was more of a kahal amongst them, even though they were an Amharites, they knew what had to be done, but they maybe not the Havarim, they weren't as much involved as they were, but they obviously they were aware of what was going on, so they should have known what was happening, between.
So there's
Ruma.
Right. So there's head knowledge, and then there's heart knowledge. There's knowing about something, and then there's caring about something. It says that a bar mitzvah boy, right? It's only when he reaches bar mitzvah that he becomes a bar chayuva, right? Well, what does that mean? He becomes a bar chayuva, that he becomes obligated at the age 13. What if you have a kid who's very sharp at the age 11? Why isn't he obligated? And basically, the answer is that there comes a certain point where there's a sensitivity and a maturity that is associated with age, and there's physical age, and then there's spiritual age. When we talk about an Amoret, we're not only concerned whether he technically knows what is okay or what isn't okay. We are more concerned about his common practice, right? Whether he is really sensitive to these laws or not. And the Amoret, we say, is someone who is not generally sensitive to these concerns and to these laws. It's not to say that he doesn't know them, and it's not to say that sometimes he won't do it right. But we, from our part, don't know what's going on in somebody else's heart, and therefore we don't know what was happening when he immersed something in the mikvah, and so therefore we're not going to accept his truma, and Kodesh we don't have a choice. But with truma, we're not going to accept it. Why? Because there are so many possible things that could go wrong, right? And we don't believe that he's sensitive enough to be careful enough to make sure that nothing contracted truma along the way before he got to us. You know, I'll give you an example, right? Some people are allergic to nuts, right? And the families that unfortunately have to deal with someone who has this terrible thing that he's allergic to nuts, it could kill him, right? You walk into that house, right? There are not going to be nuts or traces of nuts or anything that could possibly have any kind of nuts anywhere in that vicinity. And this is something that all the people of that family are extremely sensitive to and aware of, and always on the lookout for it. Somebody who doesn't grow up like that and doesn't have somebody in their family can say from today to tomorrow, yeah, we made sure there's no nuts, but they don't know that there's something else that contains traces of nuts and so on and so forth, right? Just using this as an example of how careful people were when it came to Truma, a Chaver who was careful with the laws of Tumah Tahara, and when they were bringing Truma to the Kohen, and the Amaratim who generally were not that sensitive because most of the time they weren't busy occupying themselves giving Truma all the time. They were busy out there working, coming into contact with all kinds of things that are tummy anyway, so therefore they weren't careful with the garments of their wives when they were in Nida, and so on and so forth. Things were just lying around, and therefore, and even when they emerged, we're not sure that they're sensitive enough to ensure that their immersion was done properly. So therefore, just to avoid any possible problems, we just don't accept that truma. Make sense?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. Okay, so now we just mentioned that we're concerned about Ava when it comes to Kodesh and not accepting the Kodesh brought by this Am Haaretz, which is why we make a special decree for the Chaver, that he cannot immerse one vessel inside of another vessel when it comes to Kodesh, because we're going to have to accept from the Am Haaretz. So we're trying to make sure that the Am Haaretz does it right. And the best way to make sure that he does it right is when he watches the Chaver doing it without any possible flaws, without any things that could even come to being a problem. So who's the one who is concerned about this Ava? Man Tana, who's the Tana of our Mishnah, the Chayish Le'eva, that is concerned about the possibility of enmity between the Chaver and the Amoretz. And for the Gemara answers Rabbi Yossi. It's Rabbi Yossi. The Tanya, because it was taught in a Brisa, Rabbi Yossi said, Mipnei ma hakol nemonim altaris yayin v'shemen. Why is everybody believed on the purity of the wine and the oil? For the entire year. In other words, upon the Mizbeach, together with the Karbanos, you had wine libations, Nesachim, and you also had oil that was used for the Menachos, for the flour offerings. Now, the wine and the oil that was going to be brought for these things were brought by a wide range of people. You had people who were chaverim who would bring wine and oil, and you had people who were amaratim that would also bring wine and oil for these sacrifices. So he says, why do we apply this rule that everybody's believed? So Yosef says, so we don't have an outcome that each person will now go and build his own bama, his own altar for himself, and also go and burn a para aduma for himself. In other words, if we were to reject the Amaretz and his oil and his wine, right, then what he would ultimately do is say, forget about you. I'm going to go and make my own altar. I'll make my own place where I can bring up my sacrifices if you're not willing to accept my offerings. So therefore, Rabbi Yossi came along and said, we apply the rule that we accept all their wine and all their oil. This is literally, picking the best of two evils, right? What's the better one of the two evils? Because on the one hand, I'm concerned about the Amaretz. On the other hand, if he were to go and build a Bama La'atzma, go and build his own altar and then burn a Para Aduma for himself, that would lead to a disaster. So therefore, because we want to keep everyone together, and there should only be one Beis Hamikdash, and there should only be one place to bring all of these offerings, we have to make a concession, right? Reluctantly, we're going to make this concession that we're going to trust when the Amaretz says that he's bringing the wine and he's bringing the oil and that they're tar, we believe him. So he's the same Tana that says in our Mishnah, we do believe the Amaretz with regards to Kodesh because of Eva. Okay. Amar Rav Papa says, this is also in accordance with whom do we accept nowadays testimony from an Amaretz? Again, the Chachamim are of the opinion that you do not accept testimony from an Amaretz because we don't trust them. But there's an opinion that holds that we do accept the testimony of Amaretz. Kaman, in accordance with whom is it? It's Rabbi Yossi. It's in accordance with the view of Rabbi Yossi, who's concerned about enmity. And so, although we shouldn't accept testimony from an Amaretz, but nevertheless, because we're worried about enmity, we do accept the testimony of Am Haaretz. Now, going back to the issue of a Am Haaretz who immerses his vessel inside a mikvah. What happened? We're saying we allowed the chaver to immerse one vessel inside of another vessel because we're not concerned that the Am Haaretz is going to see him. Why are we not concerned that the Am Haaretz is going to see him? Because we're saying either way, we're not going to accept from the Am Haaretz. We're not going to accept his truma anyway. So therefore, we're not gonna be worried. So therefore, you, Mr. Chaver, can you can go and you can immerse your vessel inside of another vessel. Frag the Gemara, okay, you're not going to accept his truma itself, no problem. But v'deichesh l'sheila, you should be worried about a Chaver borrowing a vessel from an Am Haaretz, and he's going to want to use it for truma. So that's still a concern. So maybe we should still say that a chaver shouldn't even put one vessel inside of another vessel when it comes to truma either. Because perhaps what's going to happen is the chaver is going to borrow a vessel from his chaver to use it, not from his chaver, from the Am Haaretz, in order to use it for truma. And the problem is going to be that the Am Haaretz won't have immersed it properly because he saw the guy putting it one vessel inside of the other vessel, and when he did it one vessel inside of the other vessel, meaning this Am Haaretz, he wasn't careful. Now, how do we know that you borrow? How do we know that a chaver borrows from an Am Haaretz? Like, who says they do? So he says that now we learned in the Mishnah. We're going to see from this Mishnah that we do borrow vessels from an Am Haaretz. What's the Mishnah? Mishnah is a bit complicated, but it's talking about a particular law when it comes to a kli cheres, okay? A kli cheres, if it is completely sealed, then even if it's in a house that has a corpse inside of it, which makes the house tamei, this kli cheres, so long as it is closed, the things on the inside of it are still tahor. Also, there's another instance where this kli cheres has a very special status, and that is if there was a skylight between the lower level where the dead body is and the upper level, the second floor, where everything else is, if you had put in this earthenware vessel that was completely sealed and you stuck it in to block up that hole, then also we say, yes, the outside of the vessel is having tumah hit it, but it doesn't contract any tummy on the outside, and the inside is sealed. And so therefore, what it will do is it will serve as a valid chatzitza, stopping the tumah from spreading to the upper floor. So now, let's look what the Mishnah says. Says the Mishnah, again, remember, we're bringing this Mishnah to show us that indeed, you'll have a chaver borrowing a vessel from an Amoritz. Okay, so let's see. Kli cheres masal alakol. The Mishnah teaches that an earthenware vessel can protect all substances from becoming tamei. These divrei Beis Hillel. These are the words of Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says, "Einay matzil elo al oichlim va'al mashkin va'al klei cheres." It only, he says that it only protects foods, beverages, and other earthenware vessels from becoming tamei. However, it does not protect non-earthenware vessels from becoming tamei. Now, 1 second. Amru lahem Beis Hillel leBeis Shammai. Hillel turned around to Beis Shammai and said like this. 1 second. Mipnei ma. Why are you making this distinction between food, drink, and earthenware vessels, and then the non-earthenware vessels? What's the difference? Either it is protecting or it isn't protecting. Why are you making this distinction? Amalahem Beis Hillel, Amru Beis Shammai. So Beis Shammai said back, Mipnei shehu tamei al gabe ama haaretz. There's a logic behind it, because what we're saying is that this earthenware that you would have protect the non-earthenware vessel from tumah is tamei on account of an amaretz, right? Ve'ein kli tamei chaitzes, and the law is that a vessel which itself is tamei cannot serve as a chatzitza between a corpse and things that are tar to protect them from the tumah, which means like this. This is a very unique law about making a chatzitza between the lower floor and the upper floor, or protecting things inside of this earthenware vessel, this earthenware barrel, or whatever it might be. However, the halacha is the only time it really works as a chatzitza is if that earthenware vessel is tahar. But what is our basic assumption when it comes to an earthenware vessel that belongs to a am haaretz? Yes, Ezra.
No, I had a question way back.
Oh, sorry.
When we were discussing borrowing a vessel.
Yes.
So my question was, okay, so let's say we don't want to cause this enmity to exist between groups. So why not borrow it, take it, you do the actual tevila of the vessel to make it tahor, and then use it as you need, and that way you show the other group that you're willing to borrow from them, but at the same time you're meeting your needs by doing the tevila itself.
So that's a very, very good question. And in fact, the Gemara is going to say that very soon. The Gemara is going to say that that's exactly what we do. We do exactly that. We borrow from them and we immerse it ourselves. So you're on the right track. That's what the Gemara will ultimately say. The Gemara will say that that's what we do. We borrow from them and we immerse it on our own. But here we're still getting to the point to try and show that the Mishnah already assumes that we're going to borrow from the Am Haaretz. How do we learn that? Well, we'll see from here, from what we're discussing right now, the fact that Beis Shammai is coming along and telling us that there's a difference between the food and the drink and the earthenware vessels and the non-earthenware vessels will show me that Beis Shammai is concerned about the chaver who's going to borrow a vessel from the Am Haaretz. So here we're now explaining to Beis Hillel why Beis Shammai makes a difference between earthenware vessels, food and drink, right, and non-earthenware vessels. Because Beis Shammai is telling Beis Hillel, listen, when I say that this vessel serves as a chatzitza, I'm being a little bit disingenuous. What does that mean? I don't really believe that it works for the Am Haaretz. Why don't I believe that it really works for the Am Haaretz? Because when we say that an earthenware vessel can serve as an interposition, a chatzitza, that only works if that earthenware vessel itself is tahar. But if that earthenware vessel itself is not tahar, which is the basic fallback position that we have for any earthenware vessel that belongs to an Am Haaretz. Why? Because an earthenware vessel can never be made pure. Once it becomes impure, the only way to deal with it is to smash it. You cannot purify it. You can smash it and then put it together and create a new vessel. Then it becomes like a new vessel and it loses its initial status of impurity. But the way it stands as an earthenware vessel, once it becomes impure, it remains impure. If that's the case, if in this case where you're using that to protect other things, it's not going to work, right? It's not going to work. Beis Hillel then says to them, what do you mean it doesn't work? If it doesn't work, then how could you say that the foods are tar and the beverages are tar in the earthenware, within that earthenware vessel? Beis Shammai says, when we said it was tahar, with regards to the food and the drink inside of it, it's la'atzmai tiharnu. We only said that it is tar for the Am Haaretz himself, right? Why? Because what is the Am Haaretz going to do with it? The Am Haaretz is not going to listen to us if we tell him that he's got to throw out all the food and he's got to throw out all his vessels. He's just not going to listen to us. So therefore we say, you know what? It's fine. For you, it's fine. Your earthenware vessels are fine. Your food is fine. Your drink is fine because you're going to eat it anyway. That's why it's fine. Avol netayr sakli. If I'm going to come along now and say that this earthenware vessel that served as a chatzitza or a protection for the things that are inside it, and I'm going to also claim that it makes pure, it keeps pure the non-earthenware vessels, then then you're going to have a problem, because when I declare it tar, I'm saying it not just for him, but also for you, which means that Beis Shammai assumes that the chaver is going to come and borrow the non-earthenware vessel. Of course, we're not going to borrow the earthenware vessel from him, because the earthenware vessel, as I said, is the default position is that it's not tar, and the food and the drink that's inside the earthenware vessel, I'm also not going to accept, because I'm assuming that's also impure. The only thing that I might come along and accept from him is the non-earthenware vessels, because those are things that the Am Haaretz can immerse and can make tahar. In that case, if Beis Shammai would say that this earthenware vessel protected the non-earthenware vessel inside of it, then the chaver who's going to borrow this vessel is going to think that it's tar when it isn't really. That's why Beis Shammai says I made a difference, a distinction between the food, drink, and the earthenware vessels and the non-earthenware vessels. Okay, so now, yeah, so far so good.
Yep.
Oh, it's 11 o'clock. So we'll stop over here, and we'll continue with this brisa, which is a continuation of this discussion, and we'll see. We will get ultimately to Ezra's point where we're going to say that we will borrow from the Amoritz, and we will immerse it ourselves in the mikvah. But we'll continue that in Mitzvah Hashem tomorrow, same time, same place.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rebbe.
Rabbi.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.